In this video, I'll talk about the 4 main ingredients that you're likely to find in most loaves of bread, which are flour, water, salt, and some form of rising agent such as yeast. So we'll start with flour. One question I get a lot is, will bleached flour work in bread? So bleaching is a natural process that happens in flour over time, and when you buy bleached flour, the process has been sped up using chemicals. So I personally stick with unbleached, but if you are using bleached, it should work for bread making, and there might be subtle differences in the dough that it makes, but it should not hurt your dough to the point where it will not work for bread. You do want to make sure that your flour is not too old and that it's been stored properly. So I one time tried to make a loaf of bread, and I had this flour and I wasn't really sure how long I had had it, and it had been summer and pretty hot in my kitchen, and I just knew right away it wasn't going to work because the dough that I made, it just wouldn't stick together. It was just kind of falling apart everywhere, and it wouldn't form that stretchy mass that we like. So that is important, just to make sure your flour is not too old. If you can't use it fast enough, you can keep it in the freezer. The other important thing about flour is the percent of gluten protein in it. So gluten is the substance that forms when you mix your flour and water, and it is made of proteins in the flour that bond with the water molecules, forming a stretchy, flexible substance. So gluten is what makes bread dough behave the way it does, being stretchy and flexible, but also elastic. So different flours have different amounts of gluten. You might get a flour that's called cake flour or pastry flour, and that will usually have about 9% gluten. That is not really what you want for bread making. That would be used for biscuits or cakes or cookies. All-purpose flour usually has about 10.5% gluten, and that works just fine for bread making. You'll also find bread flours that have higher contents, sometimes about 12.5%, and then even some that are about 14%, usually labeled high gluten bread flour. Those 14% ones, they are made for using a bread machine pretty much. On one hand, if you look at the research that's been done over the decades, you'll find these plots where they plot the size of the loaf versus the gluten content, and the bar just goes right up. But if you're working, kneading by hand, or if you try to use a 14% flour, the dough is just going to be so tough and difficult to knead, and the internal structure of the bread that results just might not be really desirable. So what's perfect for artisan bread making is about 11.5% gluten. So these days you can sometimes find specialty flours. For example, I just bought this King Arthur, and it is 11.7% gluten. It's also all-purpose, so you'll see that the names and percentages are not always consistent. So whatever flour you have available, you would want to find the gluten percent for that brand. King Arthur, puts it right on the front to make it easy for you. You might have to call the company once and just ask them what the percent is in the flour you're using. Someone asked me once if you can calculate it using the protein content in the nutritional information. I actually just tried to do that for this King Arthur flour, and the value I got was off by about 0.5%. Might have been my math. It also might be that the flour contains protein that doesn't participate in the gluten, so it might be best just to call the company and ask one time so you know for sure. So you might not be able to find 11.5% in the store. A really easy thing you can do in that case is buy all-purpose flour, which is about 10.5, and then buy bread flour, which is about 12.5, and mix them, and you'll end up with about 11.5. One other thing you can do is you can actually buy gluten. It comes in a box or a bag. It might look something like this, and it's just a powder, and you just add some spoonfuls of it to your recipe into the flour, and that boosts the gluten content. The bag will tell you how much to add per cup of flour, so you could try that too. So while I have the gluten out of the freezer, I thought I would just mix up a little bit to show you what it looks like. It's kind of fun to play with, especially if you've got kids or you're doing a science fair or something like that. I'm also always amazed by how much water it absorbs. Start with just a little so you don't overdo it, because if you add too much, it kind of doesn't hold together. But you'll feel as you mix it, it's like already turning into sort of a spongy thing. And it really just soaks the water right up as you add it. I think we can maybe get a little more water in there. So you see it makes this kind of stretchy stuff, which, like I said, it's great at science exhibits because the kids can tug on it and tell them to rip it, and they're like, "Arr!" I faked that a little bit, but kids really do that. The next ingredient is water. And so when you mix the flour and the water, all kinds of chemical reactions get underway and everything just gets started in your dough. So water is just super important. I'm not going to get into all the chemistry here. I'm going to do a different video about chemistry, but I just love looking at the list of all the things that happen in dough once you add the water. So the main question I get is, can I use tap water? So I would say that depends on your tap water. If your water is especially soft or hard, that will have an effect on bread dough. And I'll just let you search online because there are different tips for how to correct for either of those situations. As far as your water being chlorine-y, if your water does smell really chlorine-y, there might be an effect, but it should be not big enough to completely destroy your dough. So the evidence I have for that is that years and years ago, when I created a sourdough starter from scratch, I did a controlled experiment, and one of the variables was that I used tap water, and all the other starters had bottled water. And the starter that had the tap water, it did always rise a little bit less than the others, but it still rose pretty well. And starting a sourdough starter, that is like the most fragile situation you might be in. So if you're making bread and you're using baker's yeast or a well-established sourdough starter, the chlorine in the tap water shouldn't be enough to completely kill your process. If you're a purist and you want to buy bottled water, go ahead, but I use tap water all the time. The other important point about water is that the water temperature is how you control the temperature of your final dough. So if it's summertime and your house is really hot and maybe you made a pouliche last night and it's been sitting out all night and that's also kind of warm, you would want to use colder water to make up for it so that your final dough doesn't end up too hot. Or if you're mixing in a machine, that adds extra friction to the dough and can make it a little hotter, so you'd compensate with colder water. On the other hand, if it's winter time and your house is a little on the cold side, that would mean your flour is a little colder, or maybe you even store your flour in the freezer. You can use warm water to make up for that. Just kind of a ballpark figure for a good dough temperature is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. A good guess for water, if you just have no idea, would be about 65 degrees. And then you take your final dough temperature, and if it's too hot or too cold, you can make adjustments for next time. And just remember that this can change seasonally, depending on all the different factors, the room temperature, the ingredient temperature, and how you're mixing it. So salt has a few effects on bread dough. The obvious one is that salt affects the flavor of your bread. It also slows down the yeast or bacteria, which it slows down their fermentation, which makes the bread rise more slowly. That might sound like a bad thing, but it actually is good because it would just rise way too fast without that effect. So you add salt and it rises in an hour or two, and that's a good rate. And then salt also has a really big effect on the gluten. It makes the gluten kind of come together and tighten, and that really helps your dough rise in a more controlled fashion. If you ever start kneading and you've forgotten your salt, you should realize it, because you'll be trying to knead and the dough will just be sort of falling apart, and it won't be coming together for you. So a question I get a lot is, will iodized salt work? So some people do try to avoid iodine for various reasons, but as far as bread making goes, it might have an effect on the dough, but it would be very, very subtle. So iodized salt should work fine. The final ingredient is the rising agent, such as yeast or sourdough starter. So I'm going to do a different video about sourdough starter, but I'll just give a really basic description here in case you're not familiar with it. Starter is basically a mixture of flour and water that has a population of microorganisms living in it. And these microorganisms are wild yeast and bacteria that have come from the flour or from the air and established themselves in your starter. And every once in a while you have to feed it with more flour and water to keep them alive. And when you make bread with it, all the microorganisms are what process the flour into the gas and the flavor of your bread. The other rising agent is baker's yeast. And baker's yeast is one strain of one species of yeast. And it was chosen for bread making because it does what we need it to do, which is it is good at processing the flour into gas and flavor molecules. So there are some different types of yeast you might encounter. The one that was used many generations ago was called fresh yeast. And it comes in blocks. They look kind of like rubber erasers. And this yeast is not dried out at all. It is ready to use in a dough. The trouble with fresh yeast is that, well, one, it's now kind of hard to find, and it also doesn't last very long. You have to refrigerate it, and even then, it might only last a few weeks. So around the middle of the 20th century, they developed active dry yeast, and that is what you can very easily find in most grocery stores during normal times. So active dry yeast is, the yeast has been dried out to make it more shelf stable. If you don't open the jar, the expiration date might be a year or two out or even longer. Once you open it, you have to refrigerate it, but even then it will still last for months. The caveat is that with this yeast, you have to activate it before you use it. And this just means mixing it with a little warm water and flour and letting it kind of sit for a little bit before you use it in your dough. So a kind of compromise between these two is instant yeast, which is a more recent development. And instant yeast looks very similar to active dry. My co-op sells it in little bags like this. But it's a different drying process, and the idea is that you can add it into your dough without that activation period. So as far as the differences between these different kinds of yeast, some people are really gung-ho about fresh yeast. I'll just say that the bakery where I worked, we originally used fresh yeast, and at some point we switched to instant, and I did not notice any difference in our doughs or the resulting bread. So that's where I stand on it, but I'm not going to argue with anybody else. I have often, like when I do use this active dry, I'll forget to activate it because I'm used to instant, and I have not had a problem with that, but I think the reason is that the process I follow always involves mixing the dough and then having a rest period before I knead it. And so I realized that while I wasn't really activating it, I just mix it in with the flour and then mix up the dough, that it was probably being activated during that rest period. If you do activate it in some water, just make sure that you account for that water in your recipe when you make the rest of the dough, because even a few tablespoons of water can be enough to kind of throw your hydration off. So just make sure to keep track of that. Sometimes it actually can be hard to tell if what you're buying is instant yeast or active dry yeast. So this one's, pretty clearly labeled active dry, and this one was labeled instant. But you'll see them sometimes and they'll be called instant active dry. And it's like, oh, what does that mean? There's also brand names like Rapid Rise. So it can be a little bit confusing. I would just look at the instructions on it, and if it tells you to activate it, then that means it's more of an active dry type. And if it tells you you can just use it right away, then it's more of an instant type. But the naming can be a little bit tricky. So one final thing about yeast is if it's been sitting in your fridge for a while and you're not really sure if it's still good, before you risk using it in bread and having your bread not rise, you can just test a little bit of it. So just mix a teaspoon of the yeast and a teaspoon of flour and a little bit of water and mix it up and just wait a few minutes, and if it is alive, you should start to see some bubbles forming. If you don't see any activity, then it's probably past its prime.